It says it's streaming.
Michael, are we almost good to go live? I'm hoping that he's going to.
We are good to go.
We are live.
Okay.
from the viewers. Thank you, viewers. I just got a message from them. All right, Jim.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome especially to the special presentation we have this evening. We are the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. There's about a dozen of us. I'm only one of the dozen co-directors. One of my fellow co-directors, Tiffany, will be introducing tonight's featured speaker. And our speaker is Julie L. Sloan, who's going to talk about stained glass stories, Tiffany, and more in the Bloomingdale neighborhood. Boy, are we fortunate to have her. Just a reminder, Bloomingdale is generally the West 90s, the West 100s, 110s, and thereabouts, even a little bit further north and a little bit further south. We're kind of the upper West Side. If you want to find out more about us, it's really easy. Just go to upperwestsidehistory.org. If you don't remember that, just Google Bloomingdale history and you'll either get the department store or us. So be persistent. You'll easily get us. And on our website, you'll have an opportunity to throw your name and email address down if you so want. You'll get our quarterly newsletter and you'll get notices of future events and whatnot. So again, really welcome. On that history site is a blog with a lot of history that is literally nowhere else. We also have things like a complete listing of every building in the neighborhood with the architect and the year it was constructed. So have fun with that. We do so many things. One of the things we do is just tour the neighborhood every month. So our next neighborhood tour is on Sunday, April 3rd from Strauss Park, as usual, at 2 o'clock. It's a Sunday. Recently, we had 30 people on our neighborhood tour, and we go in all different directions every time. So it's always fresh. The presentations that we try to do about just every month are very topical. We've done stuff recently on Grant's tomb, and we had the great Andrew Alpern, one of New York City's great architectural historians, talking about Posh Portals, his latest book. We had another fellow who talked about just how New York City things get named, et cetera. In the past, we've done things on medical institutions, Broadway, the 9th Avenue. I can go on and on because we've done so many things. So, but with no further ado, let me introduce my co-director of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, who will introduce this evening's speaker, Stephanie Ezeron. Stephanie?
Thank you, Jim. And good evening, everyone. And once again, welcome. We're delighted to have you here with us tonight. We have a nice turnout and we've just started. I see there's 101 participants so far. So great to have you here. And before we begin, I'd like to mention that we have another member of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group with us. His name is Michael Gonzalez. If you have any questions throughout the program, please click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Michael will share those questions with us all at the end of the presentation. 2022 has been officially declared International Year of Glass to celebrate the heritage and importance of glass in our lives, which makes tonight's presentation particularly timely. If you are a big Tiffany fan, which I am, or just appreciate the wonderful art of stained glass, or simply want to learn more about what makes the Bloomingdale neighborhood special, then I think you will enjoy tonight's presentation very much. So as Jim said, the name of the presentation is Stained Glass Stories, Tiffany and More in the Bloomingdale neighborhood. And as the name suggests, our speaker will discuss the highlights of stained glass within Bloomingdale and touch on one or two other particularly notable stained glass installations in the surrounding neighborhood, but all on the Upper West Side. That having been said, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Julie L. Sloan. A little bit of background, Julie. Julie has been a stained glass consultant since 1984, specializing in conservation studies, conservation management, and history. Her New York conservation projects include St. Thomas Episcopal Church, Trinity Church on Wall Street, and Riverside Church, as well as Trinity Church and Harvard University's Memorial Hall in Boston, and Princeton University's Chapel. She is also an appraiser of American stained glass, certified by American Appraisers Association. She was an adjunct professor of historic preservation at Columbia University for 28 years, has lectured at Salve Regina University, Williams College, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and has given seminars and lectures around the country. Her BA in art history is from New York University, and her MS in historic preservation is from Columbia University. So she clearly knows the Upper West Side neighborhood. The author of Conservation of Stained Glass in America, she has written many articles on stained glass history and conservation. Her books include Light Screens, The Complete Leaded Glass Windows of Frank Lloyd Wright, Frederick Crowninshield, A Renaissance Man in the Gilded Age with Gertrude Wilmers, the artist's great-granddaughter, and The Berkshire Glass Works with William Patrickren. She also contributed a chapter to A New and Native Beauty, The Art and Craft of Green and Green, and the introduction to Frank Lloyd Wright, Art Class of the Martin House. And as if that were not enough, she is currently working on a comprehensive history of American stained glass. So once again, delighted to introduce Julie Sloan. Julie, over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to all of you who suggested sites and supplied information and photographs. Let me see if I can get my screen share going here. Okay, does that look right, Stephanie?
Yes, it does. It does indeed.
Okay, here we go. The Bloomingdale neighborhood houses one of the most spectacular assemblages of stained glass in New York City at St. Michael's Episcopal Church on Amsterdam Avenue at 99th Street. With its amazing Tiffany chancel window, a magnificent mosaic, which I won't be talking about tonight, and works by some of Tiffany's most important competitors. But other sites in the neighborhood and at its edges also house, or used to house, Tiffany windows, as well as many by other notable artists. For the next 50 minutes or so, I hope to show you some old favorites and maybe introduce you to new ones as well. Louis Comfort Tiffany was a New Yorker. His father, Charles Louis Tiffany, ran Tiffany and Company, the famous jewelry and silver store. And let me make the distinction here that Tiffany and Company always refers to the jewelry store, never to Louis Tiffany's studio, which was called various things through its history, including Louis C. Tiffany and Company, the Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, and Tiffany Studios, which is the name I'll be using. Louis Tiffany was educated as a painter at the National Academy of Design in New York and with painters George Inness and Samuel Coleman. He traveled to Europe and the Mideast, attracted both to exotic locales and to more domestic family scenes. In the late 1870s, he began looking around at other media and was particularly taken with glass. This is one of his first windows, made in 1880 for his own apartment. You can see it installed in the middle of the right side in the black and white photo. In 1879, he went into partnership with Candace Wheeler, an embroiderer, to produce decorative art for furnishing houses. The firm was called Associated Artists, and it lasted until 1883, when Tiffany established his own firm to make decorative arts that featured glass as a principal material, as well as other things like furniture and wallpaper. As Associated Artists, Tiffany made an impressive splash on the decorating scene, chalking up a number of important clients, including the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, who hired the firm to redecorate the White House. The largest piece of stained glass made for the White House was this screen in the front entry. It was demolished in 1902 when Teddy Roosevelt was elected, and only a few black and white photos of it survive. The color picture on the bottom is an artist's supposition of what it might have looked like. In 1883, he began building a mansion for his growing family to be shared with his parents on 72nd Street at Madison Avenue. It was designed by McKim Meeting White. Tiffany's private studio space was on the top floor, while the company was on Madison Avenue, then called 4th Avenue, at 25th Street. The house was lavishly decorated with Tiffany glass and the artist's collection of exotic artifacts from around the world. The bright tympanum in the dining room was gilded plaster set with glass jewels. The studio was an Aladdin's cave of Moorish lamps, Persian carpets, Oriental metalwork, and this organically shaped fireplace. Although Tiffany was quite successful during the 1880s, it was the World's Columbian Exposition that put him on a national stage. Held in Chicago in 1893 in honor of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, the fair was the largest World's Fair held to date. It covered almost 700 acres with more than 200 buildings and hosted over 27 million visitors. Curiously, there was no venue for the display of stained glass, despite it being routinely hailed as one of America's proudest artistic inventions. This is not to say that there was no stained glass at the fair. There were many windows scattered around the grounds, particularly in the Women's Building. But neither in the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Hall nor the Palace of Fine Arts was there a pavilion dedicated to the display of stained glass. Louis Tiffany had many advantages being Charles Tiffany's son. To begin with, there was the money. The Tiffany jewelry store made Charles and Louis rich. At the Columbian Exposition, there was the added bonus that Tiffany and Company had reserved a large pavilion in the Manufacturers Building on the top. It's hard to make out, but the second opening from the right there says Tiffany and Company. Louis took over the far end of the pavilion. He set up 3 rooms to display his stained glass: a light room, a dark room, and the Columbian Chapel. It was the largest assemblage of stained glass at the fair. I could spend the whole hour here today talking about just the whole display, but I'm going to concentrate on the chapel. It was designed as a sales display, not as a consecrated religious space. It was meant to appeal to any Christian denomination. Curiously, there are no contemporary photographs of it. This watercolor is the only known image of the chapel at the fair. We're looking at a white mosaic altar standing in front of an opulent dark green and blue mosaic of peacocks behind the candlesticks, beneath a series of round Byzantine arches. At the top, we can see the bottom of a cross-shaped electrolier, as electrified chandeliers were called, and 3 hanging globes. On the far left is a mosaic lectern with a tall candlestick. And on the right, set off behind columns, we can see the globe-shaped baptismal font and a window with a resurrection angel. Today, the chapel has been reconstructed in the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art in Winter Park, Florida, near Orlando. This museum houses the largest collection of Tiffany material in the world. Between 1997 and 1999, the Morse conserved the chapel and installed it in the museum. This is the electrolier, which is massive with a frame of cast iron. Dozens of green glass jewels catch the light of the electric bulbs, which were not covered with shades since the technology was new and the bare bulbs were an impressive sight. The chapel also included a dozen large windows made specifically for the fair. As exposition pieces, they're quite different from the studio's usual work. These two windows, for example, almost look like the work of two different companies. The Botticelli window in particular is very unusual for Tiffany. The entombment window was designed by Tiffany himself. The elderly man on the right holding Christ is a portrait of Tiffany's father. What's mind-bending to me is that all of this material was created for a temporary site. The fair lasted only 6 months. The objects were not sold, although they spurred other sales. When the fair closed, the chapel was dismantled and sent back to Tiffany Studios in New York. The studio exhibited the chapel in February of 1894, along with the dark room from the fair. The display was received with honor and respect, critics welcoming the opportunity for people to see it who had not been able to attend the fair. By May, however, it was rather ignominiously advertised under amusements in the New York Times, alongside Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and John Philip Sousa's band at Madison Square Garden. I think it's somewhat ironic that it was not open on Sundays, although, as I said, it was never a consecrated religious space. In October of 1894, the chapel was purchased from Tiffany for $50,000, which is about $1.5 million today, by Mrs. Celia Whipple Wallace. Mrs. Wallace was a wealthy widow from Chicago, known there as the Diamond Queen for her vast collection of expensive jewelry, which she wore all the time. She summered in Saratoga Springs, was involved with the suffrage movement, and did good works, primarily for the advancement of underprivileged boys. She'd been widowed in 1878 and lost her only child, a son, in 1882. Her aim in buying the chapel was to donate it as a memorial to the Wallace family. She was considering the Art Institute of Chicago, Dartmouth College, and the town of Saratoga Springs. The new Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York had recently begun construction, and this is ultimately where the chapel ended up. Parenthetically, in 1902, Mrs. Wallace disappeared from a trolley in Brooklyn wearing her jewels and was never seen again. In 1899, the nave of St. John the Divine was not yet usable for services, as you can see in this view here. Despite the objections of the cathedral's architects, Hines and Lafarge, the chapel was installed below the choir in the crypt as a worship space and opened the same year. The site was dark and cramped. The multiple arches above the altar were truncated to make them fit the low ceiling. On the left are the resurrection angel and the baptismal font, and on the right is the entombment window. The cross-shaped electrolier is gone, but the globe light fixtures are there above the altar rail. Although not tall, the space was deep, seating several hundred parishioners who worshiped there until 1911, when the nave and apse of the cathedral were ready for use. The doors to the chapel were simply closed and the space was abandoned. 5 years later, the cathedral asked Tiffany to take it away its ruins. Tiffany took the pieces to his Long Island estate, Laurelton Hall, where they remained until that house burned in 1957. Hugh McCain, a Tiffany enthusiast, bought the remains of Laurelton Hall in 1959 and moved them to Winter Park, Florida, where they were housed in the Morse Museum. One of the casualties of the move from St. John the Divine was the angel in the baptistry window. Tiffany removed it when he put the chapel in Laurelton Hall. The picture on the left is taken from a very lousy Xerox of Tiffany's brochure from the fair. On the right, in the window as it is now, the two center columns have lost their Corinthian capitals and the sky has developed an orange streak of sunset. Ironically, this was one of the most popular windows at the fair, and Tiffany received dozens of commissions for it. So we have a pretty good idea of what the angel originally looked like. Here in the window from the Worcester Art Museum is the closest match, having the same Corinthian columns, although it's divided into 3 panels. The right lancet has been lost. We now move to 1895, 2 years after the Columbian Exposition, to St. Michael's Episcopal Church. Construction on the church took almost 2 years between 1890 and 91. Tiffany Studios was employed to provide furnishings and decorations in 1895. In this photo, we can see that the stained glass windows are not yet installed in the apse. By Easter, Tiffany had provided the altar, reredos, and altar dressings. On Christmas Day that same year, this magnificent 7-part window was dedicated. It depicts St. Michael the Archangel after his defeat of Satan in the battle for heaven, as described in the book of Revelation and Paradise Lost. He's surrounded by the heavenly host and all the orders of angels, from the seraphim to the thrones. There are over 110 figures in this composition. An unbelievably hard window to photograph, this picture has been enhanced to be able to see it. The first and last lancets, those closest to us, are artificially lit. So if you visit the church on a weekday, they will probably not have any light. Unfortunately, the faces are deteriorating and becoming hard to read. Tiffany employed many artists to whom he rarely gave credit, which has led to the misconception that Tiffany designed everything himself. He most certainly did not. This is one of the few windows where he did identify the artists who worked on it. In an article in the New York Herald, 3 men and 1 woman were acknowledged: Edward Peck Sperry, Louis J. Letterly, Joseph Lauber, and Clara Weaver Parrish. Here's a sampling of the work of these artists once they had left Tiffany Studios. While there are differences between each artist, it would be very hard to assign any of the St. Michael's angels to any particular one of them, because Tiffany maintained a studio style, ensuring that works from his company all had a similar appearance that was recognizable as his. I'm going to talk now about what makes Tiffany windows, and indeed most American stained glass from the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, different from other periods of stained glass. On the left is the figure of St. Michael. And on the right, a window made by the London firm of Heaton, Butler, and Bain at about the same time. The Tiffany window represents the American opalescent technique, and the English window, traditional stained glass techniques from the Middle Ages to today. There are several differences between the way these windows were made and therefore what they looked like. The Tiffany window is made of opalescent glass, assembled in layers with almost no paint. I'll explain all of this in a minute. The English window is made of antique glass in a single layer, and every piece is painted. We'll start with the glass. Since the Middle Ages, when stained glass was invented around the 9th century, windows have been made with what is called antique glass. The word antique doesn't mean the glass itself is old. It means the technique of making it by hand is old. Antique glass is still made today, and we still call it antique. It's a colored glass that is more or less transparent. You can see forms through it. Imagine a glass of Kool-Aid. Opalescent glass is also colored, but it's not transparent, it's translucent. Although light comes through it, It has opacifiers that make it milky so you can't see forms through it. Imagine a glass of milk compared to that glass of Kool-Aid. Also, it can be made in a variety of textures and with more than one color in a sheet. On the left, antique glass is made by hand, even today, by blowing a long oval bubble of glass and slitting it down the side. The process requires skilled workers and is comparatively time-consuming. Opalescent glass is made by pouring molten glass onto an iron table, then rolling it flat. The table and the rollers can be textured to leave an imprint in the glass for ripples or a hammered look, say. More than one color can be poured onto the table to make a multicolored sheet. No skilled labor is required. And if the table is large enough, or on a conveyor belt with a continuous source of molten glass, as is done today, more than one sheet can be cast at a time. Additionally, it's possible to make opalescent glass to imitate other materials. One of the most famous types of opalescent glass is called drapery glass, which you see on the left in a detail from St. Michael's. While the glass was still hot on the casting table and about the consistency of pie crust dough, it could be pushed into folds using a long steel rod. Tiffany Studios made this glass, but so did other glass factories. So its use in a window doesn't guarantee that the window is by Tiffany. On the top right is a type of glass called confetti or fractured glass. This was made by scattering shards of colored glass on the rolling table, then pouring white or clear glass over the top and rolling them together. Tiffany and others often used it to create foliage. At the bottom is mottled glass, a multicolored glass with ringed spots of different colors, often used to imitate the effect of light coming through trees. Another difference between opalescent windows and European ones was the use of plating or layering of glass. The drawing in the upper left corner shows the traditional way a window was assembled, with only one layer of glass. The pictures on the right show several layers of glass piled up. This technique was patented by both Tiffany in 1881 and the artist John Lafarge in 1880. Other American artists also used it extensively, and it became a defining element of the opalescent window. The purpose of plating was to create both color and line effects that permitted artists to do away with the painting to define details other than flesh. The effects could be subtle, especially from a distance. In this window by John Lafarge, now in the Worcester Art Museum, the reflection of the angel in the water has depth and illusionism because it's plated. In this detail of the angel's hand, on the left is a straight-on view. On the right, at an angle, we can see that both hands are covered with sheets or plates of glass to create the effect of a hand reflected in water. Finally, there was the issue of paint on glass. Since its invention in the Middle Ages, colored glass has been painted to provide detail. Both of these ancient examples have black vitreous or glass-based paint to create facial details, lettering, folds of cloth, and details of leaves. The colors you see are the colors of the glass. Those are not painted on. The paint is made of ground glass and iron oxide and mixed with any of a variety of liquid media to apply it to the surface of the colored glass. It's then fired in a kiln to melt and fuse with the surface of the glass and become permanent. Because antique glass is made by blowing, it generally has only one color per sheet, and it cannot be manipulated to look like fabric or leaves or a distant sunset. The image on the left is an antique glass window before it's painted, and you can see that the scene is hard to make out. On the right, after the panel was painted, the details have been supplied, and we can see an inscription, a variety of animals, 2 figures, and an intricately patterned background. Although Tiffany claimed that good windows weren't painted, which therefore by definition made his windows great, it was a matter of taste to patrons. Now in this comparison, we can see the differences in technique. In St. Michael on the left, only the face and arms are painted. One thing opalescent glass cannot do well is depict faces and flesh. Those areas of opalescent windows must still be painted. But no other glass in this detail or in the window is painted. We can see a variety of colors in each piece of the sky above and below the angel's wings. In the window on the right, every piece of glass is painted, not only to depict flesh and faces, but also the folds and patterns of cloth, the flowers, the vase in the lower right corner, and details of architecture. But where you see blue, you're looking at blue glass, and red is red glass. Not all American-made windows were done in the Tiffany technique, however. The German-born American artist Henry Birkenstock fully painted the scenes on large pieces of clear glass. These are his windows, formerly in Trinity Lutheran Church on 100th Street at Amsterdam, which were removed several years ago. Birkenstock used colored glass paints called enamels. The red glass in Christ's robes in both windows is actually red glass, but all the other colors are painted on. Although many critics find this technique to be inferior to both opalescent and European styles, it required a great deal of talent and patience to make them. Hopefully this information will allow you to better understand and appreciate Tiffany type windows. Here in the Annunciation window in St. Michael's, you can clearly see that only the faces and hands are painted. The rest of the glass is not. Tiffany made the angel ethereal by placing a plate of glass with a smoky swirl over the leaded gown, making its lines look blurry and indistinct, as if the angel is incorporeal. In the Resurrection Angel at St. Michael's, based on the one from the Columbian Chapel, we can see the drapery glass used in her gown and wings. The darker shadows here are thicker areas of glass. Her face, hands, and feet are painted, but unfortunately the paint is deteriorating, making it difficult to appreciate the artistry and understand the image. St. Michael's also has some beautiful examples of work by one of Tiffany's most able competitors, David Maitland Armstrong. Armstrong had been an influential part of Tiffany Studios in the early 1880s and probably learned stained glass there. He was trained as a lawyer and had served as consul to the Papal States in the early 1870s, but took up art on his return to this country. When he was passed over by Tiffany for a partnership, he left the studio in 1886 and began doing stained glass on his own. His daughter Helen worked closely with him. Their style is quite distinctive. There's a look to their faces that is readily identifiable, and they tended to use a perfect circle in pale yellow or white for halos. Saint Cecilia is a prime example, as is St. Luke. Here, the head and halo of Luke are painted on one piece of glass. Armstrong's palette is also an attribute. The pair loved to juxtapose this fuchsia red against green, and they used purples to create shadows for white and red. The third Armstrong window in St. Michael's shows the angel of Revelations pointing out the city of the New Jerusalem in distant clouds on the right. Here, the city is made to look like it's far away by using plates of pinkish gray, yellowish gray, aqua, and a streaky blue over the painted buildings. Armstrong and his daughter worked so closely together that it's not possible to tell who did what in their windows. Armstrong also made the windows in the lantern of St. Paul's Chapel at Columbia University. They commemorate early graduates of Columbia College. One of the most beautiful windows in St. Michael's is by Frederick Lincoln Stoddard. He started his professional career as a stained glass designer in St. Louis, but left there in 1881 to study mural painting in Europe. He returned to St. Louis 5 years later, where he painted about 20 murals. And then he moved to New York in 1904, where he continued to work as a muralist. On the right is one of his paintings in a Brooklyn public school. It's not known to survive. On the left is one of only 2 windows known by him from this period after his return from Europe. The window was fabricated by the firm of R. Geisler, a religious decorating company. Another lesser known but no less talented artist was Walter Janes, who created the St. Agnes window in St. Michael's. His studio was on East 23rd Street. The window is based quite literally on a Renaissance painting by Andrea del Sarto. The painting was reproduced often in the 19th century, which is probably how Janes knew of it. It was not uncommon for stained glass artists to liberally borrow from the work of other artists. Janes worked with his sister, Frances White, who designed many of their windows, like this one in West End Collegiate Church on West End Avenue at 77th Street. They were highly respected as artists and were published in the International Studio magazine. There's one church on the Upper West Side in which all of the windows are by Tiffany Studios. This is a rarity anywhere in the country. This is the Lutheran Church of the Advent on Broadway at 95th Street. Its unassuming facade masks one of the most stunning windows made by the studio, along with St. Michael. It's called the Te Deum. Christ is surrounded by the hosts of angels, with the disciples in the foreground. In the center below Christ is the Archangel Michael, breaking the sword after the battle for heaven. This scene could be said to take place just a few minutes after the one in St. Michael's Church, in which Christ had not yet arrived on the scene. Comparing the 2 windows in Advent and St. Michael's, we can see a change in the way the faces are drawn. Advent's window was made in 1901, only 6 years after St. Michael's. But by this time, the artist Frederick Wilson had become the head of the Tiffany Ecclesiastical Department and the principal designer of their figural windows. The change is most evident in the faces. Wilson's faces are very sweet and idealized, with a definite pre-Raphaelite influence from his training in his native England. Compare it here to a drawing by Sir Edward Burne-Jones, one of the leading figures of the pre-Raphaelites. The Annunciation window in St. Michael's is also by Wilson and has a typical Wilson face with bobbed nose, cupid bow mouth, red cheeks, and curly blonde hair. At the opposite end of Advent Lutheran Church, next to the altar, is this window depicting St. Paul preaching at Athens, with the Parthenon in the left background. In this detail, we can see the spectacular glass used by Tiffany Studios, the creamy white drapery glass in his robes, colored and shaded by plating, and the mottled blue glass behind him, like dappled light coming through the trees. This is also a Frederick Wilson window, as you can tell from the faces. St. Paul preaching at Athens, while an important event in Christian history, is not the most beautiful scene. But here we have another example. This is the only window by John Lafarge in the Bloomingdale vicinity today, installed in the apse of St. Paul's Chapel at Columbia. It's a very difficult window to photograph because of too much light in the chapel and a bridge outside that casts shadows. But it's important to include Lafarge in any discussion of Tiffany. The two artists envisioned the use of opalescent glass at the same time. Lafarge patented the process 6 months before Tiffany did, and the two were equally recognized as the most important designers of stained glass in the country. They were never friendly and were fierce competitors. In Lafarge's watercolor sketch for the window, you get a better idea of the brightness it was intended to have. Lafarge lacked any business sense and did not have the resources of a large company to execute his windows, so he created many fewer of them in his lifetime than Tiffany Studios did. But he also didn't have to keep hundreds of people employed, which freed him to do what he wanted in glass. As a result, his windows are far more experimental than Tiffany's. There used to be more Lafarge windows in the neighborhood at the Bloomingdale Reformed Church on Broadway at 107th Street. The church opened in late 1906. They commissioned Lafarge to create all of the windows in the building. At the east and west ends were the largest. You can see the west one here above the front door. The windows were in place when the church was consecrated. Sadly, the church closed only 7 years later in 1913, when the congregation disbanded, and it was torn down shortly after that. The windows were moved, at least in part, to the Hamilton Grange Reformed Church at Convent Avenue and 149th Street. The Hamilton Grange Church closed in 1937, and the building was taken over by the Episcopal Church of the Crucifixion. It burned down in the 1960s, and the Lafarge windows were lost. The east window of the Bloomingdale Reformed Church was dedicated to an active member, Mrs. George Henry Gilbert, an actress who was described as the sweetest and saintliest old lady of the theatrical profession. She died the year the church was begun. It was said to be only the second window in this country dedicated to a thespian, the first being another Lafarge in memory of Edwin Booth in the Church of the Transfiguration, or the little church around the corner on East 29th Street. At the top of the window is the risen Christ, based on a window Lafarge designed for the First Congregational Church in Methuen, Massachusetts in 1894. The lower scene of the Gilbert window is unique, showing the angel at Christ's tomb telling Mary Magdalene of the resurrection. The window from Church of the Ascension on Fifth Avenue at 10th Street on the right is of the same scene, and the figure of Mary dressed in red is similar to the Gilbert figure. The west window was given in memory of Runyon Pyatt Sr., father of one of the church elders, and descended from both Huguenot and Mayflower settlers of the New World. The figure here was originally designed for a mural in the Church of St. Paul the Apostle near Lincoln Center, but was never executed there. I'm showing part of those St. Paul murals to give you an idea. They are no longer there. There's one synagogue on the Upper West Side for which Tiffany provided all the windows. This is Congregation Shearith Israel, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue at Central Park West and 70th Street, built in 1897. Here the windows are all decorative. The company also made a window featuring the Ten Commandments for Temple Bethel on the Upper East Side, which is now in Temple Emmanuel. In most Protestant congregations, donors commissioned memorial windows from their chosen artists and gave the window to the church. This results in there being few records of the making of the windows in church records and a wide variety of artists and styles within one building, like we see at St. Michael's, which is typical of an Episcopalian church. In Catholic churches, by contrast, which are owned by a diocese and not a congregation, the windows often were commissioned by the diocese and all came from the same studio, so that we often find a cohesive story depicted throughout the windows, usually the life of Christ or the patron saint, represented in windows all of the same style. Another site like St. John the Divine that used to have a collection of Tiffany windows is today the Hostel on Amsterdam Avenue at 103rd Street. It was designed by Richard Morris Hunt and built in 1881 to 83 as a home by the Association for Respectable Aged Indigent Females. The building was almost torn down in 1974, and its Tiffany windows were donated at that time to the Morse Museum, the same place that the Columbian Chapel now resides. It was declared a New York City landmark in 1983. The Morse Museum has done extensive research on these windows and was kind enough to share it with me. The original chapel, designed by Hunt, contained 5 Tiffany windows made before 1897. That chapel was replaced in 1908 when the association decided to build a new one donated by Mrs. Russell Sage, which is the one shown here. The original windows were moved to the new space and more were made by Tiffany. Unusually, they all commemorate women. The dedicatees were all on the board of the association at the time of the construction of the home. These 3 windows were at the front of the chapel. In the center is the story of Hagar and Ishmael, condemned by Sarah to wander in the wilderness, but saved by God from starvation, a fitting parallel to the lives of the home's inhabitants. On either side are symbolic windows, joined in design by the same decorative border. The organization of the other windows is conjectural because the photograph isn't clear enough to make them out. These 3 windows all have the same border, suggesting that they were meant to be seen together. And these 2 are thought to have been on the opposite side of the chapel because they have a different border from the first side. One window opening was never filled. Although the windows are not on display at the Morse Museum, they bring them out at Christmas and display them outside in the park near the museum. Another church in the neighborhood with Tiffany windows is Annunciation Greek Orthodox on West End Avenue at 91st Street. It was originally the 4th Presbyterian Church, designed in 1894 by Hines and Lafarge, the first architects of St. John the Divine. The Lafarge in the partnership was one of John Lafarge's sons. 4th Presbyterian was sold to the Greek congregation in 1952. Facing West End Avenue is this monumental scene of the Transfiguration, based on the painting by Raphael. This is another example of artists liberally borrowing from other artists, and not even Tiffany was above it. In the chancel are 2 Tiffany landscapes representing spring and autumn. As far as I know, they are the only Tiffany landscapes in the area. They date to 1928, the year that Tiffany retired, although the studio didn't close until 1936. They were designed by Agnes Northrop, one of the studio's most important artists. She worked for Tiffany her entire career and created most of the landscapes for which the studio is famous. I will close with the window that has probably been the most talked about in the city for the last few years. It's the main window in the former First Church of Christ Scientist on the corner of Central Park West and 96th Street. It depicts Christ and Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. The building was erected at the turn of the century by Carrere and Hastings, architects of the main branch of the New York Public Library. It was designated a New York City landmark in 1973. The congregation sold the building in 2004, and battles have been waged since then on an appropriate new use for it. It's currently owned by the Children's Museum of Manhattan, which has plans to gut the building, which has already lost all of its magnificent decorative plasterwork, and remove the windows. Nothing is known about the window, which has led to a lot of speculation about who designed it. The other windows on the side, on the 96th Street side, which I'm not showing here, are known to have been made by the Decorative Stained Glass Company, located on Washington Square, where the NYU Law School is now. This studio fabricated John Lafarge's windows, which has led to the attribution to him. But it's not accurate. Lafarge did not design this window. The Decorative Stained Glass Company built windows for many other artists in addition to Lafarge. More recent speculation based on style suggested authorship by Herman Schlottermunt, a New York artist who did a lot of design work for Carrere and Hastings, including windows for the Flagler Memorial Church in St. Augustine and City Hall in Paterson, New Jersey. This on the right, on the left, is a detail from Schlottermunt's principal window for the state capital of Missouri for comparison. Based on the poor quality of the photo of the Christian Science window, I can't make that attribution comfortably, but I think it's an interesting possibility. The Children's Museum presently plans to donate the windows to the National Building Arts Center in Sauget, Illinois, a suburb of St. Louis. And that's all I have for you tonight. I hope this has been informative, and I thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julie. That was wonderful. I learned so much, and it's hard to believe that at one time the Columbian Chapel was considered ruins, having seen it at the Morse Museum, where it's just gorgeous. But these are the kinds of things that happen over time. So yes, I'm going to turn this over to Michael, if he would please share with us. I see there are a number of points in the chat, and there are a few in the Q&A as well. So,
Yes.
okay, there you go.
Oh, thank you so much, Julie. That was a beautiful presentation. And honestly, these windows are such amazing variety and so many different kinds. A few of the questions we've gotten throughout the night was, one of them was, do you know what is involved in the restoration of deteriorating stained glass, such as the painted sections of windows?
Restoring deteriorated paint is one of the hardest things that we confront in stained glass restoration. There are a few different ways to do it. The safest being to paint the missing areas on a piece of clear glass and plate it over the original glass. It becomes difficult in faces like those in Tiffany windows because they used so much paint, and the deterioration is spotty that we end up with overlap of the new paint and the old paint. So we end up basically outlining the missing areas. So it's also an ethical question about whether it should be done. So every project is different, and the projects themselves make the decisions whether to restore the paint. St. Michael's window has been restored at least twice, and the congregation obviously made the decision not to restore the faces.
Thank you for your answer. Another question we had was, do you know if the St. Paul Chapel at Columbia University is open to the public?
Often. I don't know how often, but it can be, yes.
And then follow another one is what window is in the City Hall of Paterson, New Jersey?
It's I believe there were two, and I think part of one is left. And the interior of the building has been changed so that now there's a floor that runs through the middle of the window. So I believe it's now sort of stuck in an office or a supply closet or something. It's hard to see. I think you can see it from the outside better than you can see it from the inside, but it's on the back of the building.
Thank you. Someone wanted to know where the chapel in Florida was. Give me a second.
The chapel is in the Morse Museum in Winter Park, Florida.
Right. Okay. Winter Park is the location they were looking for, I believe.
Yes. Yes. Winter Park is outside Orlando.
Let's see. Anyone else have any other questions for tonight? Oh, which is the church in New York City that displays stained glass panels at Christmas?
That's the Morse Museum in Florida. The windows from the home for aged, respectable indigent females.
Got it.
That's Florida. Yeah.
Someone wanted to know that it was stunning photography, and particularly the St. Michael's windows, which is also pretty high up. So it's impressive to get a good look at those details from there.
I took the details, but I did not take the main photograph of the window. I futzed around with it a lot on Photoshop. But I was not able to get good pictures of the main window myself.
There was a mention of a Mrs. Wallace earlier in the conversation. Do you know the full name of that person?
Celia Whipple Wallace. She purchased
Thank you.
the Columbian Chapel from Tiffany.
I have a question here. This is Jim Mackin. There's some local law that the windows in St. Michael's Church were financed, in essence, by money from Mrs. Zimmerman, who was part of the Prentice family. And I'm wondering if we know more about that. But a more general question, Julie, was Lafarge and, let's say, Tiffany connected with any particular church, any particular sect, or they were all just happy to get the high quality works from either one of them and others?
Lafarge was Catholic, and Tiffany, I think, was either Presbyterian or Methodist, but that didn't affect who they worked for.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, after the opalescent age, Ralph Adams Cram in his neo-Gothic buildings began saying that an artist should be of the same denomination. But in the opalescent age, they didn't necessarily discriminate. Although you do find congregations being a little more discriminating. A German Lutheran or a German Catholic congregation would tend to hire German artists. And the Episcopalians tended to hire what sounded like English names. So you do find that happening.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
Commercial clients also? I mean, were there commercial ventures that had Tiffany glass?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they all made windows for commercial buildings. I'm drawing a blank on commercial Tiffany's. John Lafarge made an enormous window for the Frick building in Pittsburgh, for example. So yeah, and they made a lot of domestic windows as well. Church commissions, religious commissions were probably half of their work, and the other half was commercial and domestic. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, we have a question from Wynn Armstrong. I think she wanted to talk, so let me allow her to unmute. Give me 1 second. When you should be able to unmute yourself, let me know.
No,
You're still muted, Win.
I know, I'm clicking it.
You're on now.
There we go. Okay. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. One of the things I note in our area is that a number of the stained glass windows are disappearing because of really because of neighborhood changes. The Trinity one that you mentioned is left partly because of financial reasons, but a major reason is that the congregation is now a very mixed ethnic congregation, and many of the people in the church were concerned that the religious images are all white. The Lafarge, or the questionable Lafarge in the Christian Science Church, is disappearing because it's no longer a church, it's a museum. And the Tiffany windows, as you noted in the hostel, disappeared also because of neighborhood changes in the use of the building. How much do you find that happening? And are other images using stained glass showing up in other places?
Well, there's certainly a demographic change, particularly churches in general, but Catholic churches in particular. The Catholic dioceses are closing churches down left and right, but they usually save the windows and the other religious decorative elements from the building for reuse in other Catholic churches. And there are Catholic churches being built around the country, and they take windows from previously used Catholic churches. That said, there are hundreds and hundreds of windows in storage. Of course, if it's a Tiffany window, it can generally be sold if it's not donated. There are many collectors of Tiffany windows. Although there aren't as many churches being built now, there are other buildings using stained glass. And I won't say that the stained glass profession today is going strong. It's fairly healthy, but there's nothing like the amount of stained glass being bought today that there was 150 years ago. But it's used in civic buildings, it's used in airports, it's used in churches, but not as much. It's still used a lot in residences. So there's still a business. There's still suppliers, although they're drying up too. Yeah.
One more question we got from the chat was, how would someone go about finding out about a stained glass window in their building?
The way I do it is to look for newspaper articles. In New York City, you can look at the building records and see if there's a mention of the stained glass. It depends on the kind of building. If you are living in a building that used to be a Gilded Age mansion, then it's probably written up somewhere, like in a newspaper. If you're living in a building that was an apartment house, you might find it in the building records that ABC contractors, a building construction company, hired XYZ stained glass studio to supply all of the glazing. But 9 times out of 10, you can't find it, particularly if it's not an important building by an important architect.
Michael, any further questions?
It seems like that was it for the questions. Yes. If anyone has any further questions, please put it in the chat.
Give that a moment. There is one question asking if the program is being recorded. Yes, it is, and it will be on the website.
Yes, I'll be up by tomorrow afternoon.
Great. I think that is it for the evening. Julie, thank you so much. It was fabulous. Jim
Thank
and
you.
Michael, anything further to mention on your end before we close for the evening? No? All right.
No,
And
that's it.
big thank you to Julie and big thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.